All right, everybody. I know this dinner today is yummy, and everybody's munching away and having a wonderful. Can't. Oh, you got to get that close. No. Which voice would you? Never mind. Welcome everybody to the December Free Speech Forum. It's glad to see everybody here. A reminder to everybody that this is a nonpartisan kind of thing. 501c3, we welcome questions from all different points of view, as long as it's understood that the purpose of this is to elucidate more information from the speaker, and especially about the issues at hand that we're talking about today. To introduce today's speaker, Alan March, one of our board members and our treasurer, will do that.
Thank you, Jay. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce. I'll just hold it closer. Okay. It is my distinct pleasure today to introduce Warren Goldstein. He is a U.S. History Professor Emeritus from the University of Hartford in Connecticut. He's authored and co-authored a number of books of very diverse topics. One, Playing for Keeps, about the history of baseball. And then A Holy Impatience. It's a biography of William Sloane Coffin, excuse me.
This crowd knows who he is.
Yeah, all right. The cleric and chaplain at Yale University, and finally, most recent book, For the Love of Physics, co-authored with astrophysicist Walter Lewin. Professor Goldstein today is going to address the historical perspective of the state of American civil liberties from the 20th century Red Scare to the Blue Scare of today.
So, thank you all for having me here today. It's a real honor to be here with this group. I've seen some of the other speakers. They set a high bar. I'll do what I can, even though I'm a professor. I'm going to try not to go. I'll go under 42 minutes. I'm going to try really hard to do that. And I'm going to try to avoid getting into the weeds. But before I begin, I want to say a couple of introductory things. First off, I want to introduce two of my guests here today, and that's Howard Simon and Beth Wilson. And I wonder if they could just stand for a minute. These are free speech warriors in Florida's history. Howard was the longtime executive director of the ACLU of Florida and was just recently honored at the 70th anniversary of the ACLU of Florida in Miami. This past weekend, right? So it's a real treat to have Howard and Beth here with us today. In fact, Howard was reminding me of something that he was telling me the story of something I didn't know. Those of you who know Miami may also have known, or may know Gable Stage, which was headed for a long time by Joe Adler. And Joe Adler was a plaintiff in a lawsuit that it made important law, undid the Cuba law in Miami. And Howard did that along with the ACLU of Florida. Let me also introduce my dear wife, the Reverend Dr. Donna Scopper, who's right there, who's the interim pastor now of the United Church of Gainesville. Obviously, I'm more nervous than I thought I was. So, by word of introduction here, I'm going to talk about periods in American history that, unlike most groups I talk to, you folks lived through. And, and because some of you have memories, if not as vivid as they once were, some of you have memories of these periods and some of these actors, I'm going to talk less about the things that you know most about. So I'm not going to spend as much time on Joe McCarthy as you might like me to, because you lived through Joe McCarthy and you had to deal with Joe McCarthy and McCarthyism. I'm also going to spend less time on Richard Nixon and Alger Hiss, because you folks lived through that period and you may know a whole lot about it. I'll certainly mention them because they're important, but I'm going to spend a little more time on the things that you did not live through and therefore have a little less familiarity with. I'm certainly open to questions about it, and we'll see if I've gotten the balance right. So this is a kind of a template to understand the various scares I'm going to talk about. And I'll tell you, by the way, this was not my idea. The idea came to me when I was listening to an Ezra Klein podcast. Some of you may know Ezra Klein, the columnist for the New York Times. He has a weekly podcast as well, and he interviews really interesting guests. And one of the people he interviewed was a political scientist, political theorist named Corey Robin, about a month and a half ago. And the title of the episode was, "Is the President Building a Blue Scare?" And by blue scare, he meant to contrast it with or connect it to red scares in American history. And almost all of us know something about the Red Scare of the 1940s and mostly the 1950s. Very fewer of us know much about the first Red Scare of the 20th century, which began during World War I. Basically from about 1917 to 1923. What these scares all have in common, I'm going to argue, is that they are wanting to go back to something before what the country was currently living through. And all of them and all of them have real targets. And I actually went to say that differently. They have targets that were genuine. They were not only made up. It has become fashionable, I think, to imply that the various Red Scares, that McCarthyism was sort of made up out of whole cloth. It wasn't. The first Red Scare was not made up out of whole cloth either. It had genuine targets because there had been important achievements by people on, generally put, the left of the American political spectrum. And that included, in particular, workers and unions, immigrants, women, black rights, and other left liberal issues. Now I want to move it's always hard to know where to start these things. I'm going to call the arbitrary date I'm going to start 1917, but you can't understand 1917 without knowing just a little bit of what had happened in the previous 20 years in the United States, beginning in the 1890s. Next slide, please, Alan. So, one of my pet peeves is people who put PowerPoints up and then read every word. And I don't know how easily you can read these. Some slides are easier to read than others. But I'm going to assume that most of you can read. And can read these slides, but what I want to do is to try to put what began in 1917 in some kind of context. There are about 3 or 4 things that I want to mention. First off, it was a fantastic wave of immigration into the United States. They were called new immigration because it was predominantly immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe that really began in the 1890s in a big way. That was really different from prior immigration, which had been mostly from Northern and Western Europe and tended to be whiter and Protestant, as opposed to swarthier and Catholic and Jewish. These are my people as well, who came in the 1880s and early 1890s from Lithuania. But American cities were changing dramatically during this time, and I love this statistic that I ran across, that in 1900, a majority of men over 21 were foreign born. In Chicago, it was 70% of the population in 1875 was either foreign born or the children of foreign born. Oh, I forgot about those, the bells. And even though we have been a nation of immigrants for a good 200 plus years, That doesn't mean that the Americans that were here when the immigrants came were happy about it. And so there had been intense nativism and hostility, and sometimes violent hostility, to immigrants. And you can see some examples here. Mobs set fire to Jewish-owned shops and houses in Louisiana and Mississippi. I apologize for the typo. Boycotts of Catholic merchants and the like. Next slide, please, Alan. There were also massive conflicts between employers and workers during the 1890s, some of the largest strikes in all of American history. Every single one of these concluded violently. All of them ended with United States troops shooting into mobs of workers. Sometimes workers fought back, by the way. It was not at all difficult to own a gun, and workers sometimes defended themselves. But this was something that was on American minds in the 1880s and 1890s. These were, I mean, the 1877 railroad strike was a nationwide strike. So was the 1894 Pullman boycott. Homestead, Pennsylvania strike was at one of the largest steel factories in the country. The Haymarket Affair in Chicago ended up with a bombing that set off a wave of anti-radical activity for the next 5 years. Next slide, Ellen. So now we finally get to 1917. What this is about is the fact that when the United States declared war on Germany in April of 1917, the country went into almost a frenzy of anti-German hysteria. And these are some of the smaller evidences of that hysteria. Can everybody read this list? I particularly, so book burnings in the United States, book burnings were not invented by Nazi Germany. I don't know who invented book burnings, but I know that there were a ton of them in the United States in 1917. This one about McLean County, Illinois, where a crowd of 300 surrounds an evangelical German Lutheran church, demanding that the parishioners stop using German or they'd burn down the building. North Dakota, Montana, Delaware, and Louisiana, oh my God, more typos. I thought I was good at this, but anyway, banned teaching of German in school, and Iowa and Nebraska banned the use in public of all foreign languages. Folks who spoke to each other in their home language, if that had been German, were apt to be harassed and occasionally arrested. Next slide. And by the way, some of these documents, I didn't dig them out. And for the first Red Scare, I'm relying a lot on the work by Adam Hochschild, the journalist historian who's written a bunch of books that you probably heard about. And this one is called American Midnight. And I'll show you the title later on. But I learned about this article in the New York Times from Hochschild. And if you can't read it, this is a 5-column article by an alleged academic, a professor of psychology, arguing that German itself is a barbarous tongue lacking in cultural worth and of no commercial importance. This is the language of Bach, Brahms, Beethoven, Wagner. Next slide, please. But it wasn't always just harassment, and it wasn't just intellectual condescension. Here, masked patriots beat pro-German. A guy is taken from his home. He was known to have pro-German sentiments. A posse came to his home, beat the crap out of him, and compelled him to kiss the flag and sing the Star-Spangled Banner. Next slide. That's right, New Haven, Connecticut, home of Yale University, where that professor could have taught, by the way. I don't know where he taught. So these are a list of the ways American language changed during World War I. Anybody remember freedom fries? Right? But the hot dog, the lowly hot dog, it had been a Frankfurter until World War I. Thank God, sauerkraut has come back. But hamburger, look at how much American culture came from German culture. There were large numbers of German immigrants throughout the Midwest and in New York City. Many of them provoked cultural conflict because Germans like to drink on Sunday in beer gardens. And American Protestants, if they did like to drink, they certainly didn't do it on Sunday. And they didn't do it in public. But it's at the middle of the list here, though, is something kind of important. That anti-German sentiment combined easily with longstanding anti-Semitism because some Jews were Germans as well, and a lot of the Jewish bankers in New York City were German. And in fact, the first wave of Jewish immigration to this country happened after the failed 1848 revolution. So my name sounds German. It's not. My great-grandfather took it on because a friend suggested it in New York Harbor in 1886. We don't have any German in us at all. But most Goldsteins or Goldsteins, and by the way, most of them say Goldstein because it's more assimilationist. It makes us seem more American if we don't use the German pronunciation. Anyway, these are other Jews who were German. So when World War I broke out, there were lots of non-naturalized immigrants in this country, and 500,000 of them had to register with the federal government, which then looked at all of these and decided to detain somewhere between 6,300 and 10,000. I've seen different sources say different things. It's not at all unusual for the United States to intern aliens, as they are called, in time of war. And in fact, some of the exact camps that were used during World War I were used again in World War II to intern Japanese Americans. And for all I know, they're being used now. But I haven't followed the current internment camps. The United States government confiscated $500 million in German-owned assets during World War II from people who had businesses. Next slide, please, Alan. Okay. Anti-German hysteria is at its peak during World War I. And by the way, the Hochschild book on this is chilling. In fact, I told Donna she was away most of last week. It was a good thing she was away because I was too depressed because I was reading these horrible stories and I was not much fun to be around. But the book by Hochschild is a beautifully written book that tells you more than you might ever have wanted to know about the first Red Scare. Then, as if someone is really rolling the historical dice to make a whole lot of stuff happen at the same time, the Bolshevik Revolution happens in Russia in 1917 as well. This scares the pants off Americans for a number of reasons. One is that the Bolsheviks had made no secret of the fact that they thought that World War I was an imperialist war and shouldn't have been fought, and it was just going to kill a whole lot of workers. And so they promised to cut a separate peace with Germany as soon as they came to power, which they did, which of course really ticked off the Allies who were counting on the Russians to have a second front during World War I. So it threatened the war effort. And then lots of immigrants in the United States by then. I mean, the massive Jewish immigration that came to the U.S. beginning in the 1890s and peaked when World War I basically stopped it, came from Russia. Lots from Poland, but the great majority came from Russia fleeing pogroms, and lots of them were radicals. And that's why I have this paragraph here about, to be honest, many were radicals. Not all of them, but lots were, including one of the best known, which is Emma Goldman, who was an anarchist and labor organizer. Next slide. Just so you could see Emma Goldman, one of the better pictures of her. Too few of the pictures are taken when she was a young, beautiful woman. I know, right, the clothes, right? She was remarkable. But also, anarchism had different strands in the 19th and 20th century, but hers was occasionally the bomb-throwing type. So she and her lover, Alexander Berkman, spent time in jail because they tried to assassinate Henry Frick, the steel company executive. Next slide, please. So the machinery of repression really builds up during World War I, and this becomes the first Red Scare. Bolsheviks are communists. There's a small communist party in the United States, but there was a pretty substantial bunch of socialists in the United States in the early 20th century as well. And most of us, that history has been mostly lost. I mean, historians know about it. General public doesn't know about it at all. The idea that there could have been 1,000 socialist public officials in local and state offices in 1917, most people don't know. That there were 175 in Oklahoma. Oklahoma socialism was a real thing. 23 socialist mayors in 1917. The government passes two of the worst pieces of legislation that are still on the books, alas, as we're finding out, and useful, the Espionage and Sedition Acts, which criminalize anti-war speech. It also invents the Bureau of Investigations, which was the precursor to the FBI, and a young man, an extremely hardworking 24-year-old, got appointed head of the Bureau of Investigations in 1917 or I think it was 1918. His name was J. Edgar Hoover. Next slide. So what I was calling the machinery of repression had a lot to do with the postmaster. Albert Burleson figured out that he could declare all kinds of magazines and newspapers, because how else were people communicating with each other? There were telegrams, but you didn't put out a magazine on a telegram. So there's no online in those days. And he decided that they were unmailable. And so what that meant was people could not communicate with each other on the left. And he'd insist upon reviewing all of them. He would tell local postmasters to send him copies so that he could review them for potentially subversive content, and he required them to give translations. There was an enormous foreign language press in the United States at this time. And so he insisted they send translations for review. And those translations piled up on his desk in the Postmaster General's office, and they basically died. You can see that banned books are not something that were invented recently. The War Department sent a list to the American Library Association. Anyway, overall, at least 1,000 people were convicted under Espionage and Sedition Acts. Next slide. There were also bombings. Some anarchists were really setting bombs, and there were two groups of bombings. The first one killed a couple of people. The first one on June 2nd, actually, in 1919, turned out to be the single most consequential bombing probably in the United States, and you've not heard of it. Next slide. It bombed, and this doesn't really that's the house of A. Mitchell Palmer, the recently appointed Attorney General of the United States, who was a Quaker, by the way, and many people figured that one of the first things he did when he came into office was release a number of German citizens who had been rounded up at the beginning of the war. Something like 10,000 had been rounded up really quickly. He released them. And he could have been expected, possibly because of his Quaker background, to oppose the war. But his own house was bombed. And it's a terrible story. Next slide, please. You can get a better sense of what the bomb did. It actually killed the bomber, and it made such a noise in Washington. Next slide, please. This is the next wave of bombings, but it made such noise that young Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was Assistant Secretary of the Navy, came over to find Palmer, who, fortunately, he and his family were on the top floor. But the whole bottom two floors were just completely wiped out, all the furniture, everything. And they would have been killed if they did down below. But also, former presidents were living in the neighborhood. It made an enormous impression on Palmer, who was really shaken by it and really decided, we got to do something about this. And so he started rounding people up. Then there was another, several months later, there were 9 bombs, actually, 8 bombs set, 9 bombs in 8 cities around the country. Something that really hadn't happened before in U.S. history. Next slide. So Palmer then made common cause with J. Edgar Hoover and engaged in 2 Palmer raids. They've come down in history as the Palmer raids. The first on November 17th, picked up a little over 1,000 people. They invaded a meeting of the Union of Russian Workers, which was doing night classes. The building was trashed. People were pushed downstairs, beaten, put into jail. And then the second one was the really big one, and that was just on January 2nd, 1920. Something like 10,000 people were rounded up and jailed. And one historian, as I put it there, argued that this was, except for slavery, the greatest single violation of civil liberties in American history. While many of these were communists, most of them, I mean, not all of them were, and what they thought about the war, no one really knew. They hadn't been engaging in a lot of anti-war activity, but the existence of the Socialist Party and the Industrial Workers of the World, which was a left-wing bunch of union organizers, were basically destroyed. Next slide. I'm sort of waiting until the House of Representatives tries this on some, I'm surprised they haven't tried to do this already, but 5 socialist members of the New York State Assembly were called, they went to work one day and they were called to stand in the well at the front of the chamber, and their seats were declared vacant. They would not be seated. Same thing happened to one of the 2 U.S. socialist reps in the House. Some of you will know Kennesaw Mountain Landis, who became famous as the first commissioner of baseball. He's the guy who bounced all the folks involved in the Black Sox scandal in 1919. Prior to that, he had been a terrifically anti-labor judge. Oh, the Eugene O'Neill story. Eugene O'Neill took his typewriter. He was living on Cape Cod writing plays, and went out to the beach one day and was writing, and the reflection off his typewriter went onto a nearby building where someone thought that he was sending signals to German ships out to sea, and he was arrested at gunpoint. This wasn't just the federal government, by the way. Lots of states did copycat legislation. Next. No one has really done a good job of collecting all the figures on how many people were arrested and for how long they went to jail. Just a few states have done it. Next slide. The other big thing that happened in American history during this time was the beginning of something most of you know about, the Great Migration. So the the black population was almost entirely southern and rural. Folks moved north during this time, beginning in 1917, partly to take the place of men who had gone off to war, white men who'd gone off to war, and they took their places in factories, partly to flee the sort of epidemic of lynchings that took place in the South during this time. But they stayed in the North, and once black folk got north, they discovered that the white folks who were already living here weren't happy about this at all. So in 1917, there was, these riots are called race riots, but somehow race riot implies that blacks and whites were fighting each other. This is not the case. These were white riots against black people who occasionally defended themselves. So that's why instead of saying race riots, I said racist violence in 26 cities in 1919, along with 83 lynchings. Next. The first conscientious objectors in American history in World War I were treated so horribly that it's really, the accounts of how they were treated are extremely hard to read. And by the way, those in World War II were treated much, much better. The sadistic torture and beatings that was common during World War I did not happen so much in World War II. The bottom line there is about waterboarding. A lot of the U.S. military had served in the Spanish-American War and then gone to the Philippines to put down the rebellion of the Filipinos, who thought that the war against Spain, when the U.S. beat Spain, would mean they could be free. But we had no intention of allowing them to be free, and so the U.S. fought about a war against Philippine guerrillas for like 2.5 years. The estimates vary on how many Filipinos were killed, but they start with 100,000, and torture was common. And the water cure, which is the precursor to waterboarding, was extremely common then, and that's when the U.S. military first learned about waterboarding. Next slide. I realize that I'm taking far too much time on this, and we're never going to get to the present, so I've got to go quickly here. But essentially, overreach helped it fizzle out. That is to say, this Red Scare fizzled out after the Attorney General predicted, along with Hoover, that in May Day 1920 there would be a mass uprising of all of these folks, and nothing happened. It was a little like Y2K, only with a lot better publicity. And also, some of the federal court cases backfired. And lawyers in the room may know something about the 12 Lawyers Report. Howard, does that sort of make it into common discussion these days? It was an interesting thing organized by one of the really few heroes of this whole era, who organized a bunch of lawyers to analyze the way in which detainees were treated and during World War I. And it's a devastating report. And at least Hochschild claims it's become a sort of, it's used in civil liberties law today, or taught. Next slide. And the origin of the ACLU was during this time, basically founded to defend conscientious objectors during World War I. So that's one of the very few bright spots out of this period. The Socialist Party was basically destroyed. Next. Oh, goodness. You know, I saw that mistake earlier, and I thought I'd corrected it. Oh, well, must be a different version. The New Deal, as you probably figured out. Next slide, please. Aside from reducing the influence of unions and killing the Socialist Party, the biggest achievement of the era was the worst immigration law in American history. It's the Johnson-Reed Act of 1924, which was pushed by a key congressman pushing the Red Scare. What it did was it changed U.S. immigration law so that in the future, the number of people who were allowed to come from each country was based on their proportion in the population in 1890, when the country was overwhelmingly white, Northern and Western European, and Protestant. So that meant that 95% of people from Southern and Eastern Europe were basically frozen out of immigration. Go one step further. One more slide, please. This is something that I have been stewing about since I read it and figured it out. Because history moves in these weird, sometimes karmic circles that are incredibly upsetting. When the Johnson-Reed Act passed, Adolf Hitler was in jail. He made note of it and put it in Mein Kampf. When the Nazi Party had come to power in Germany, he and his guys got together and tried to figure out what the legal structure was they were going to create to contain Jews. They looked at segregation laws very carefully. They conducted a lively study and conversation with eugenicists in the United States in the 1920s and 1930s. It was a popular movement to make sure that we weeded out the undesirables in the population. Many states passed sterilization laws during this time. And then, of course, the law was in place while refugees from Nazi Germany were fleeing the beginnings of the Holocaust, and that law kept them from coming to the United States. Millions of Jews were murdered by Nazis because there wasn't any place for them to go. And this country, with the Statue of Liberty and the torch shining bright, turned them away, partly based on our own immigration laws. I don't know quite how to get that out of my head, I confess. And I was a professional historian for 30 years. I read about a lot of bad stuff. This may be the worst, that for me personally, that comes out of this. Next slide. So this is Hochschild's this is the name of the book. feel free to take the picture of it. It's a great book. He's a really brilliant writer. But how are we supposed to avoid another scare like this? Well, we should know about history so we can see danger signals. And what are we seeing today? An absolute evisceration of the teaching and study of history in schools. We need brave men and women inside and outside government. There were almost none in 1917. An equitable distribution of wealth. What we're living through right now has the most inequitable distribution of wealth in American history, except that in 1929. We need a mass media less craven toward those in power. We're going to jump to the blue scare in a second. Above all, we need a vigilant respect for civil rights and constitutional safeguards. Well, get to think about that. Next slide. Now, I'm going to skip the second Red Scare. I'm doing violence to what I said I was going to do, but I want to get to the present, and I've spent too much time on the first one. So keep going, Alan. Keep going. You got about 10 slides to get through. To be a beautician in a lot of states, you had to clear the list. That is to say that you had no connections to, well, like the Cuba law, Howard, that you were telling me about in Miami, right? You couldn't do business with Cuba. You couldn't do business with someone who did do business with Cuba. And that's what beauticians, to get a license to fish in New York City public reservoir, you had to quote unquote clear the list. Keep going. We're going to get there. And there's a great book on the blacklist. By the way, go back one slide, just one for a second. Most Americans don't know this, but the American Legion was actually the central anti-communist organization of the 20th century. It began in the first Red Scare, and its posts loved to beat up labor organizers, radicals, wobblies, members of the Socialist Party, and the like. They only grew, and during the second Red Scare, they grew to 11,000 posts, and they were on constant call to interfere with anybody vaguely on the left. Next slide. Keep going. Keep going. We're going to get to the blue scare. Bingo. Finally there. You're about to see some parallels. And what I'm calling the blue scare, and what Ezra Klein wanted to call the blue scare, is an attempt to intimidate folks on the left and liberals, or what have been recently called by the President of the United States, radical far-left lunatics. Note the targets and note some similarities, and you'll see them to the other two Red Scares. Immigrants, always. Now we have gender ideology. One of the things I did not talk about, because the second Red Scare was also a lavender scare. Washington had become a pretty gay city in the 1930s during the New Deal. There was a very lively LGBT culture, and lots of women moved there. Eleanor Roosevelt was a significant force there, and there were just a lot of gay folk in Washington, and it was a relatively liberal city in gender terms. The second Red Scare went after those folks as security risks and ruined dozens, if not hundreds, of careers. Now we have an attack on trans people and gender ideology, which is, by the way, I'm an academic. I study these things, I teach these things. There's no such thing. There are gender studies professors and departments. There is no such thing as gender ideology. There is something called DEI, and that was actually founded in the wake of George Floyd to try to figure out how to make faculties and workplaces more diverse and a little bit more equitable and a little bit more inclusive. That actually does exist. Now people are scrubbing this off. I don't need to tell people in Florida. I don't need to tell people at UF what it has meant to have DEI, to have your administration and to have DEI. Universities were a target of both Red Scares, especially professors. Unions Absolutely. The NLRB right now is essentially the National Labor Relations Board, founded during the New Deal, is essentially non-functional right now. The museums, the Smithsonian's been attacked, the National Museum of African American History has been attacked, the money that was funding museums and libraries has been cut, so that libraries, dozens, hundreds of libraries across the country and museums have lost federal funding. Those of you that have ever been trying to get grants while at UF, you know the NEA and the NEH, National Endowments for the Humanities and the Arts. Those are targets. They've essentially stopped funding anything. And you see the targets are similar. Next slide. And while it's not World War II or World War I, the right wing does have its sort of founding moment, or its energizing moment in the Charlie Kirk assassination. And you know all this. This is very recent history. This is current events right now. Next slide. And by the way, let me just point out in terms of partisanship, Jay, because I want to be careful here. The first two presidents under which all this stuff happened were Democrats. Woodrow Wilson oversaw the first Red Scare enthusiastically. It actually took Warren Harding and Calvin Coolidge to actually release the people who were still in prison. So the Democratic president put them there. During the second Red Scare, it was given cover by Harry Truman, and really prosecuted by Harry Truman, a little bit by Dwight Eisenhower. Joseph McCarthy was very useful to him, but Eisenhower was a national hero. So this is bipartisan. You probably all know this quote, or if you haven't, you probably read it and you tried to forget it. This is the deputy assistant to the president talking about what he's going to do to dismantle the networks that made possible, if you can't read it, with God as my witness, we are going to use, and he's a Jew, by the way, with God as my witness, an embarrassment to the race, we are going to use every resource we have at the Department of Justice, Homeland Security, and throughout this government to identify, disrupt, dismantle, and destroy these networks and make America safe again for the American people. It will happen. We'll do it in Charlie's name. And the stated targets are people like the Ford Foundation and George Soros's Open Society Foundation. Next slide. So, the wrap-up. All three of these scares went after the real achievements of people on the left. The blue scare happening right now has to do with what people accomplished during the last 15 years or so. And those are meant to roll back genuine accomplishments in all of those that all of those targets had achieved. Confederate statues coming down, renamings of sports teams and military bases and ships. Next slide. What do they have in common? The only thing we're missing a whole lot of right now is violence. There wasn't a tremendous amount of violence during the second Red Scare. There was an enormous amount by the first. No one's been lynched for the crime of being a liberal in America yet, but many of the targets and methods are held in common. There are vigilantes in all three. Next slide. I said that I was going to provide a lot of hope. And when I was doing the deep dive into this history, there's just a whole lot less than I had hoped, that I thought I was going to find. You got to note that there were great dissents, but no Supreme Court victories at any point during this time. The best thing I know, and by the way, the last line here is important. I put small d, democratic resilience of the American people. I kept trying to put it in the word, kept wanting to capitalize it because it was the beginning of a phrase. But I wanted to be sure and say, this is not about Democrats or Republicans. This is about democracy, and that doesn't need a capital D. And that's the one thing that I've seen in these other two. People really did push back finally, and they'd had enough. And there you have it.
Thank you so very much. Alan, if you can help me out. Alan, if you can help me out. Is that better? Sorry about that. Questions and answers? Anything about a fizzle?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, so I have one about
Testing, 1, 2, 3.
three. Is that,
Hold on a second, David.
okay.
So I have a question for you that ties in with hope, and that is this, that had you studied how Italy navigated out of when they assassinated Mussolini and he had all the people whipped up that they were going to be a great Roman Empire again, when they assassinated him, how did they move towards where they are today? Because apparently you would think they're in more of a democratic place than they were under Mussolini. Do you know what mechanisms or stages Italy went through after they had killed their dictator?
Fortunately, I can answer this really easily, no, because I'm a U.S. historian. I know almost nothing about Italian history.
Sorry.
Does your wife need her lunch?
Donna, you have a lunch here if you want it. Okay, good.
Okay, I'll take it.
Thanks.
It's ready now.
This lady right here.
Thank you for your talk.
You're welcome.
If people want to get a feel for the current danger, all they need to do is visit a detention center, an ICE detention center, and see the, how can I describe it? The torture and the atrocities that are going on right there, right now.
For those of you that didn't hear, if you want to get a sense of what's going on right now, visit an ICE detention center where people are being served substandard food. They often don't have bedding. They don't have decent heat and access to toilets and the like.
Yeah, thank you. Great talk. Very stimulating for thought.
Thank you.
It seems to me that currently there's a lot of pushback. What am I doing wrong?
This one,
Yeah, I think you might just have to talk really loud.
just talk loud.
Okay, it seems to me that there's a lot of pushback currently. Federal judges are ruling against Trump's executive orders. There is a lot of organization in medicine. There are, organizations like the Infectious Disease Society, American Academy of Pediatrics, who are actively pushing back against government policies. Was there a similar kind of organized pushback back in the Red Scare of the 20s?
I am so glad you asked this. And the answer is no, because the fear was much, much greater. And I do think that there is considerably more pushback now. Lower courts are definitely pushing back. The Supreme Court's not. But the lower courts are, and that will leave us with a body of law. And I do think that professional societies have been fantastic. Look, the American Library Association has been heroes of mine ever since the Patriot Act was passed. So there is much more. That's part of what I was trying to put into one word by the democratic resilience of the American people. Yes, it's really, really important that, for one thing, the political parties are not totally collapsing. Or rather, one of them is doing less collapsing in the face of this onslaught, I believe. And the professional societies are critical. And I think that's really important. At the moment, we're sort of stuck with the current Health and Human Services Department, which is trying to make us a whole lot less healthy than we were even during COVID. I mean, it's pretty astonishing. But I do think that you're onto something super important. And that is something to take hope. That is something to take real inspiration from. And frankly, it was really hard to have meetings like this in 1951 and 1952. We could easily have been picketed by the Minutewomen, for instance. We could have had someone busting in the door and trying to find out who the vendor was for lunch. in 1950 or 51 or 1919 or 1920. That's not happening right now. We can have this conversation, and we are not worried about who's outside that door. Right?
A little worried.
Okay. Fair enough. Fair enough.
We have some security.
I understand that there is some security here, for which I am grateful.
Hold it close.
Okay, yeah, a couple things. In your talk, one of the things I thought about was within Hitler and how he was inspired by the treatment of the U.S. treated Native Americans, and for the reservation culture led him to. So again, U.S. history, Christian nationalist history strikes. Weimar Germany was also very active with LGBTQ people.
Yes.
The Nazis used that very much. Again, that moral hysteria. I heard a thing, this isn't original with me, but we hear a lot of talk about Christian nationalists, you know, these people. They ought to reverse it and call them nationalist Christians. And then we just could call them Nat-Cs for short.
You're a lot cleverer than I am.
Somebody else did that, I just repeated it.
I'm not so clever.
Oh, pass, okay.
Yes, sir.
What scares me more than anything is that it appears that Trump and his backers, Stephen Miller and etc., are using the Nazi playbook, but they're looking at where the Nazis failed and they're building on how they can improve that. And that is really scary when you think about it.
Well, you know, there are not many, we're not seeing a lot of assassinations of people who are organizing unions, serving as union officers or union members. We're seeing none of that right now. So I'm not happy, as you may have figured out, from the state of affairs right now. And I see disturbing parallels with the 1940s and 50s and the first Red Scare. But I am not seeing the level of violence that it has taken in other countries. It's taken that form in other countries. It's not happening here in anywhere near the same way. I can stand up here and say that I'm a speechwriter for the American Federation of Teachers, and I don't have to worry that someone is going to try to fire my wife from her job right now. I will confess that I was going to post something on Facebook about a month and a half ago, and it was highly political, and I thought twice about whether I was going to do it, partly because I know people, and that includes my dear wife, who have gotten a pile-on. And if you've ever had one of those pile-ons on social media, and people dox you, and there are folks out there who really want to make your life miserable, they can do that. I was embarrassed. I've never had that feeling before in my life, and that's been brought to me courtesy of the current administration. So I get what you're saying, but I think we're still, and by the way, I ended up posting it later because I really was unhappy with myself. But the risks that people took by saying the simplest of things or going to the simplest of meetings were enormous in those earlier times. And they're not so much now. Obviously, people have been fired. I mean, we didn't talk at any length here, but there are about 40 academics that have been fired, you know, for saying insufficiently appreciative things about Charlie Kirk when he was assassinated. So the Chronicle of Higher Education is keeping an ongoing list of those firings. The Chronicle of Education would have been harassed into shutting down 50 years ago or 75 years ago. It hasn't been so far. That doesn't mean there aren't horrible things happening right now. There are. They're the kinds of things that should make free speech advocates really unhappy and really worried. But also, we're better off now than we were in the late 40s and early 50s. So far. So far. Yes, sir.
Well, were they rounding up people like they are with, say, the Latinos?
Thank you.
You know, there aren't any Latinos much here. We feel that we have a half Latino family and we couldn't do Thanksgiving together because we were.
Thank you for saying that. The answer is yes, but not as part of the Red Scare. I mean, Operation Wetback, that's what it was named, sent back something like 1.5 million to 2 million Mexican workers who had authorization from the United States to work in the American Southwest in agriculture. And a lot of U.S. citizens were rounded up as part of those crackdowns and sent back. But no, you're absolutely right to point this out. We are not, the roundups of immigrants took place during the first Red Scare, and people were deported, and they were detained. But in the second Red Scare, not so much. Not so much. Emma Goldman was deported, but only with several hundred other people. So there weren't the kind of mass deportations. No, the mass deportation thing right now is much greater than any, I mean, it has outstripped Operation Wetback. Early 50s, not 40s, but it has outstripped that, and we haven't had that in U.S. history.
One last question.
One last question? Yeah.
I wanted to thank you for a wonderful talk,
Thank you.
and my head is buzzing with all sorts of questions. But I'll take the one that probably Joe Curtis should have asked, which is that there's a fundamental difference between let's say any time earlier in past where there were lots of newspapers. Towns were served by often more than one newspaper
Yes.
that brought the information
Yes.
to in whatever filtered manner, it did bring the information. Now that information industry is really in a very strange place. And
More and more consolidated by the day. Yes.
would you care to elaborate on that?
Well, you know, I'm not an expert on these matters. I mean, you said it as well as I could certainly say it. The consolidation of news is terrible. Monopolies are a bad thing. You know, in the last administration, we had a Federal Trade Commission that tried to undermine monopolies and tried to stop them from coming about. We have a current administration that doesn't care and it serves it just fine. So yeah, the access to news, on the one hand, it's greater than it's ever been through the internet. On the other hand, the consolidation is not good and does not bode well for the future, as you know better than I do, probably. Could I do a one point of personal privilege and ask Howard, give Howard a chance to say something, given his long history?
Go right ahead. Oh, okay, sorry.
I just want to make a couple of points. First of all, being here, giving this talk here, you probably should take note of the fact that here, Florida, Gainesville, University of Florida, was the center of the Florida's second Red Scare. We had a Johns Committee that was the equivalent of the House Un-American Activity Committee, in which was started as an investigation of alleged communists in the civil rights movement. When they couldn't uncover communists in the civil rights movement, it turned to uncovering gays in higher education.
Wow.
Numerous LGBT professors were fired throughout the state of Florida, but mainly here at the University of Florida in Gainesville. So we had a kind of a state equivalent of the second Red Scare that started here. A couple of comments I want to make about, I think we ought to go out and have some beers and argue about this, but I think I'm not as sanguine as you are about the similar level of violence. Because I think we're going to see, and I think we have seen, a rise of political violence now that we have not seen.
We have.
And I mean, even the Trump Department of Justice has documented a significant increase in political violence from the right. Witness the state senators and that were killed.
Yes, in Minnesota, right.
I do want to make another comment. I do think we have to take into account that it probably will be, to be realistic and honest, it'll be a long time before we undo the damage that has been done already in this country through the political, to try to be nonpartisan about it, the political developments of the last decade or so, primarily because of what's happened to the courts. The courts have made a revolution in this country without changing the Constitution. A revolution in women's rights, a revolution in voting rights, revolution in what's happened with public education and separation of church and state and so on. But I don't like to leave people with a negative feeling,
But you'll do your best.
to be hopeful. I do think a good deal of the future of this country rests on turning the corner, changing things, depending upon the outcome of the 2026 midterm elections. That, I think, is going to maybe what rescues, if anything rescues this democracy, it will be the outcome of that election.
Thank you, Howard.
Thank you, Warren, for a wonderful presentation. As our guest speaker, we give you with the ceremonial First Amendment Foundation cup.
All right.
You can use it for beer or coffee, whatever you like, so it's fine. Since one of the points of the talk here has to deal with trusted communication and media and things of that sort, I'm happy to mention that our next month's speaker from the university will be on the consortium on trust and truth in the media, and she will come and address some of those topics from an academic standpoint. So happy holidays to everybody, be safe, and try to enjoy yourself.